Robotics. So we have three really interesting papers to talk about regulation and governance, and lots of other things, the history of automobiles, and drone regulation, and the ethics of medical robots, and lots of other things in these papers. What we're going to do is, just in terms of the process, is I've asked each of the three authors to prepare a very brief, not even really a summary as much, although they're welcome to summarize if they want to, but more sort of to try to isolate what they think of as the contribution in their paper, what they were trying to do or what they think they have done in each of their individual papers, to see what they think is the core of what they're doing. And then I've prepared a bunch of questions for them, hopefully provocative, about themes that I think appear in all of the three papers, although in different forms. Questions about history and the use of historical parallels in thinking about regulation. Questions about norms and how norms develop, which I think is illustrated in various ways in these papers, about how we intervene in machine design. Questions about paternalism, a bunch of things like that. And I will put those on the table sort of one at a time after they've gone through their little brief discussions, and sort of we'll have a conversation here among the four of us. Let us all sort of chew on those questions. I will probably pause after we've gone through a few of those to let you into the conversation if you have sort of follow-up questions, or if something about the discussion strikes a chord that you want to amplify on or comment about. I think that would be a good way to get the discussion going across into the audience as well. We could do that for a little while, then we'll come back and I'll throw out a few more questions, and we'll do the same thing, and we'll sort of see how it goes. This is very, this is WeRobot people. This is free form, and we're learning as we go as to what works. And then at the end, I'll reserve some time before the end for sort of general questions that sort of didn't come up, if you have other things that you would like the panelists or specific authors to address. We'll have time for that as well. So, going alphabetically, Peter, Jason, and Kristen, I guess, and also from left to right, as it happens, to give you a little, tell us what you're talking about.
All right, thank you, David. So this paper is just trying to kind of wrap my head around what does it mean to regulate robots? And there's been a lot of discussion at previous WeRobots and different ideas thrown around, but I think really in the last 6 months or so, there's been a flurry of really interesting articles and research papers coming out that focus on this idea of regulating robots as a sort of enterprise unto itself. One by Ryan Kahlo about whether we should create some kind of federal regulatory commission for robots. There was another one that was a Brookings Institute technical report. There was another Brookings Institute report by Heather Knight about trying to regulate robots through good design and human-robot interaction. And then you had the Google acquisition about a year ago of DeepMind, which had this built-in requirement to create an internal ethics advisory board. And I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years at an international level, thinking about fully autonomous weapon systems and how do we regulate or prohibit those. And these are all sort of radically different modes of regulation. So I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around, well, what are the connections between these? What are the relationships between them? What can we learn by sort of looking at them side by side? And what lessons can we take out of kind of previous experience? And the FAA has been kind of struggling with the kind of federal regulation of these small drones and robots as well, and there's been a lot of developments in that and maybe some missteps and stumbles. So that's kind of, the paper sort of reflects on that, and I guess where I really see some similarities is that we have this more fundamental problem about what I call disruptive technology. I think you call it transformative, but that's maybe why I'm wearing black today or something. But But there are these technologies that force social change, right, in various ways. And, computers did this and cars did this, and we're sort of aware that it's happening and we react to it, but we wind up with regulation that's very reactionary. So how can we sort of be progressive or forward-looking about how these social transformations are going to happen and what kinds of regulations we want? And in order to do that, we really need to understand the social values that are at play and norms. And looking at the literature on norms, which itself is, if you go to different disciplines, it's very different. So social theory has different understandings of norms. Philosophy has a certain understanding of norms. Law has a certain understanding of norms, and international law in particular about. And then you get international relations and international law, and their view of norms is that you sort of have established practice and custom, and then it becomes codified, but it has to sort of be there for a while. So the idea of thinking about a future norm is sort of paradoxical, and I think it's been something that's caused a lot of confusion at the United Nations in our discussions about autonomous weapon systems, is because people aren't really used to thinking about a norm as something that could be in the future, right? It's always something that already exists. And so if we're creating a technology that's going to have new norms around it, how should we do that? And so one view is that, we just let it happen. But that seems to me sort of folly, right? You're just going to wind up with whatever happens. And if whatever robotic system, and it was happening with international trade as well, it's destabilizing our existing norms. And we can try these analogies to existing frameworks and try to extend that and try to force these into the existing frameworks, but they really are hybrids and they really don't fit. And we're going to run into problems if we try to just do that. So we should try to be more progressive and kind of take it head on, but how do you do that? How do you envision what those norms should be? So I think my conclusion is what we really need is innovation around norms. And there's a lot of discussion usually about regulation as being something that stifles technological innovation. Right? You don't want to over-regulate because then you're going to shut down technological innovation. But it seems to me that we're at a moment where we don't really have a problem with not enough technological innovation, right? We're getting a lot of robust technological innovation, and where we're really sort of falling down is on the innovation around norms. And why don't we actually invest in innovation around norms, and how do you do that? And I think to some extent we can look at how these other structures like an ethics review committee could be thought of not just as imposing or enforcing regulation, but thinking about what those norms might be. And I think this happens in a lot of stakeholder situations as well. And we should really be thinking about who are the stakeholders in these situations, who are the voices, how does the public and civil society get to participate in this? A lot of the federal regulatory systems are heavily dominated by industry trade groups and major industry players, and society doesn't always have the same kind of voice. But in the car realm, you can get the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that can be a very powerful force. Or in the FAA, you get these Model Aircraft Association being very powerful and getting certain concessions in the FAA regulations. But you still have to have this kind of political organization. But I think, these systems are going to infiltrate so many aspects of society. We really need a lot of these voices participating in that, and we really need to be investing in norm innovation.
Okay, well, thank you. I have to admit, I had a lot of fun writing this paper. It's one of the few papers I've had just a lot of fun writing, and I think for whatever reason, it's something that I've been leading up to for a long time. I feel like through past discussions here at WeRobot, just past work that I've done, trying to translate some of the work I do in philosophy to the engineering discipline. And what got me most excited, I think, was when I saw the call for papers this year. They were asking specifically for solutions, right? Okay, this year at WeRobot, we want papers that offer solutions to these problems that we've been kind of tossing around for a few years. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do the best that I can do to come up with what I would think of as a solution for designers, right? So my background is in engineering, and now I'm trying to work on philosophical concepts and draw those into the engineering world, see how they apply nicely in robotics and other kinds of automation technologies. So that's where really this paper was born out of that kind of interest in translating work from one discipline into another, which is something I've been trying to do for a while. So I have a bunch of notes here. I think the best way that I can do this is just blast through these notes, and then we can open up, get the other synopsis of the paper, and then get straight to the questions. So one thing I notice is that engineers, when you're talking to engineers about how to do ethics and pull ethics into their work, they do need often, it's helpful, and this is true of any kind of translation work, is that it's easier to codify these things in sort of tools, standardized things that people can use, frameworks that they can adopt, and kind of wrap their heads around, because you're talking about taking one expertise and kind of injecting it into another expertise. So you need to codify it somehow in these translations. So I decided to draw on some of the work I've done in the past and really push forward to start developing a tool that could be used in the design room. And the tool that I propose in this paper anyway, I think could serve as a way of codifying design practices. And I think there's a really nice synergy in this paper with what Kristen talks about in her paper, which is wonderful, when she describes the distinction between regulating the user versus the designer. So if you're going to regulate the designer in any way, if that's your interest, how might you do that? Well, you might mandate something like a framework that's similar to what I'm proposing. So this is certainly, and of course the framework that I'm proposing, the whole intention of bringing it here to WeRobot is to open the discussion and to really start that debate happening about what these tools should include in them. So when I sat down to write the paper, I asked myself, if I were an engineer trying to use the kinds of knowledge generated at the past few WeRobots, how would I do that? And there is a huge amount of translation work that's needed to bridge that gap between kind of theoretical concerns and practice, especially when you're talking about, well, not especially, but at least when you're talking about ethics theories. And that's true when you're talking about translating theory into policy or regulation, true when you're trying to translate theory into the design room. The point is that something needs to fill that gap so practitioners can apply the theoretical concerns that are raised in other academic contexts and really understand how it applies to their work specifically. So in this paper I focused on a specific set of problems that I've identified in the past, just as really an example more than anything. And those problems revolve around automating ethical decision making and autonomy violations that result in this kind of idea of autonomy by design and paternalism by design. So in this paper, I proposed a very specific design norm as an example of where we might launch this kind of ethics evaluation tool into practice. And I think it's actually the kind of norm that when I read Peter's paper, he might be concerned about innovating. So Peter talks about the need for norm innovation. And I'm happy to call this, the norm that I propose anyway, an example of that. It borrows from kind of bioethics approach to solving problems, but certainly it's a different kind of norm that isn't currently recognized in design contexts. So I also in this paper propose 5 specific, sort of general specifications that any ethics evaluation tool should meet. And again, the tool is used for doing an ethics evaluation in the context of robotics design. And like I said, they're open to debate. So for example, and this ties nicely, I think, into Kate's paper that we were talking about this morning, another great paper. I argue that when we evaluate the ethics of a robot design, we ought to recognize and accept as given the psychology that's wrapped up in the user-robot relationships that occur in the use context. So this is because it's clear, it isn't clear to what extent we can change the psychology in that context. And I think Kate's work is like starting to really push into that world. And I love the fact that, being an ethicist, I love the fact that she's turned this kind of black and white problem into a very gray problem. Ethicists love the gray zone, so I'm happy about that because it really it makes relevant the nuances that are going on when we're talking about anthropomorphism and the effects that that has, and whether we should or shouldn't anthropomorphize. It's context dependent. It's very case specific, and I think that's the kind of thing that we need to start thinking about, because it's not clear that we can change that, or to what extent we can change that in any given use context. So what else do I do in this paper? I provide a first cut of what I would call a working document. That's what I would say is the design tool that you could use to guide an ethics evaluation in the design room. And I hope this is a first step towards a debate that would, start revolving around these kinds of tools in general. And then I use one of the user experiences that I bring up in the paper as an example of working through, a kind of hypothetical design problem. And showing how the tool might be used, right? So my general approach borrows heavily from the clinical ethics model employed in Canada and to a certain extent in the US. I'm proposing a kind of capacity building approach to injecting these tools into the engineering design world. And this is exactly the same as bringing an electrical engineer. I see no difference between bringing an electrical engineer and a mechanical engineer onto a design team and socializing them each to take into account the other experts' concerns in terms of design. So injecting ethics and ethicists into the design team, we have an ethicist here who's doing that kind of work today. So doing that kind of work is no different than having a multidisciplinary approach to doing engineering that we already accept in engineering today. So the question David asked me to consider was, how does this impact regulation? And the truth is, I didn't write this paper from the perspective of regulation as a starting point anyway, but I think that it has pretty obvious implications for anyone interested in figuring out how to regulate. So we could imagine using these tools to satisfy regulatory requirements for ethical analyses, just like standard tools are used to demonstrate safety compliance in design, the kinds of tools that Kristen discusses in her paper. We could imagine bringing ethics and engineering students together in order to socialize them to work in interdisciplinary modes. And that could result in norm innovation in an educational setting so that, as we move forward as engineers in practice, it just becomes kind of the backdrop of what we do. We're more inclined to work with across disciplines to solve these kind of problems that, again, have been raised in maybe, I call it theoretical, but maybe that's not totally fair, but in sort of theoretical terms at WeRobots and in other contexts. So you could also see those tools integrated into professional best practices and used as a legal test to gauge whether or not a manufacturer followed industry standards, something like that. And I've talked about that before. And I think that this would be very similar to what we have in a sort of medical liability model, at least how I understand the way that medical liability works from a legal perspective. And I'll just wrap it up there, and maybe we can move on
Sure, great.
get to discussion.
Okay. So this paper came about as sort of a first opportunity. I just started my doctoral studies, and so it was an opportunity to start thinking about how can we regulate robots and drones in particular. I had no idea where to start, so I thought, why don't I start by looking at the past? And so looked for another technology that was similarly, or that was pervasive, that has a spatial impact, that has a cultural impact, as I predict, and as I think all of us sitting in this room probably predict, robots are going to continue to have, and drones will have and are going to continue to have. So that's why I chose the automobile for this paper, and that's explained in greater depth in the paper. So just to summarize quickly, because this is all set out more in detail, but I think there are 3 takeaways, and this is a working paper, and I'm looking for input and feedback to take this and develop it further. But 3 takeaways as far as governance and as far as how can the law not be reactionary, but maybe be proactive and get involved and govern rather than as Peter mentioned, just react. First takeaway that I got from the history of automobile regulation is that the law needs to think beyond just the user. So laws that say speed limits. You can't drive beyond a certain speed. Buckle up your seatbelt. Or laws that say you can't fly your drone in this location. Don't fly your drone over the White House. You need to keep your drone in line of sight. Or don't fly your drone in somebody's apartment window line of sight. Don't necessarily go deep enough. They don't necessarily prevent those kinds of actions from happening. And we see those examples happening all the time in the news, and that was obviously the case and has always been the case since the advent of the automobile, with the car as well. And so we see throughout the long history of automobile regulation that what we need to do is, or what regulation needed to do, was go deeper than that, and we need to look at laws that also say not just buckle up your seatbelt, but there needs to be a seatbelt in the car. The steering wheel needs to be designed to be smooth enough that it doesn't kill or maim on impact. And so with drones, this can include regulations like, I have some examples in the paper. Drones need to emit signals to broadcast their presence or their approach, or something along the lines of a license or registration, like this drone belongs to so-and-so, or can be traced back to this individual, maybe through some kind of anonymized licensing database along the lines of a license plate, just as examples. And those are examples of something that I think actually ties in really well with what Jason and Peter have both talked about in their paper in terms of both norm setting and what kind of privacy norms or surveillance norms, or as Woody talks about, obscurity norms, do we want to start thinking about, and how can those be designed into the drone, which is what Jason talks about in his paper. So that's the first big takeaway, and this isn't anything new, and I totally recognize that the underlying fundamental principle here is not anything new. The principle being technology is not neutral, design isn't neutral, but I think it bears repeating because what we're seeing in terms of drone legislation now is the same thing. It's all laws that are user focused, so they all say don't fly your drone over the White House, but then we have a drone crashing into the White House, and we have don't fly drones over Paris, but then drones fly over Paris, and Paris police spend weeks trying to figure out who's flying them and can't trace it back because there's no registration system or signal broadcasting the presence of those drones, or where they're coming from, or how to say, like, license them back to an individual flyer. So that's the number one takeaway point from the first lesson of the automobile history, or from the first segment of the history that I take from that. The second takeaway point is, so why do we need law? And that starts to emerge from what I've just been talking about, but this is a more of a value added, so stepping away from just the fact that design isn't neutral. A takeaway there is that there's also there is no market incentive to design for improperly used technology. So with the automobile, we saw that there was no market incentive early on to design those smooth steering wheels or to include seat belts in the original design of the car, because customers just didn't know to demand it, and there wasn't any push, I guess, there wasn't any push from the customer base for the manufacturers to incorporate those designs into the vehicle itself. And so I'm sorry, I'm totally losing my direction in terms of the second lesson, but there's a market failure there, and that's where there's a role for the law to step in and for regulators to step in. And that's the point that I'm taking away here, is that where we have a market failure, we have a place for regulation. And that this is a problem that we're seeing similarly in the design of robotics, that if customers don't have the design expertise, which is lacking in terms of a complicated technology, then there's not going to be a demand for, say, an integrated design component that protects privacy. So while customers might understand that panoptic sense of being watched or observed by drones, customers might not be able to understand something that could be incorporated into a drone to, say, address that issue, or to give us a sense that that drone problem could be dealt with. And then we see things like the recent Ipsos poll that says that, I believe the number was 42%, but it's actually cited in my paper if that number is incorrect. But I believe it was 42% of Americans don't support private drone ownership, personal drone ownership. And that's a problem because this is a technology that could be very advantageous and that could be very valuable. But if people don't feel comfortable with it, we're actually going to lose the benefit of a technology because there isn't a regulation that makes us feel comfortable with it. And that actually reflects exactly what was happening in the early regulation of the automobile, where people were concerned about high speeds of the car on the roads. It was scaring horses. And so cars were heavily treated with great suspicion and great discomfort until laws were put in place keeping cars at low speeds and making people feel more comfortable with the technology until eventually it just took off on its own anyhow. And so here we see a place where regulators can actually get involved and help with, along the lines of the norm setting that we're talking about in terms of the governance, easing the emergence of the technology into society and making us feel more comfortable with dealing with these issues. The third takeaway point is that in order to make that work, we need to distribute some of the responsibility between both users and the technology itself. And because part of the problem with legislating design is that you're putting legal responsibility onto manufacturers, which obviously isn't something that manufacturers are going to be very happy to accept. So if you require manufacturers to, say, make it so that drones cannot fly or are incapable of flying over the White House, then any failure in the algorithm or the software that prevents that from happening means that now there's a legal responsibility on the manufacturer. And so if something terrible happens, that manufacturer is now responsible. And so you'll see industry pushback if there's not some way to also put an onus on users or maintain the onus on users through both education and laws that continue to prohibit users from using drones or any other robotic technology inappropriately. And so the same can be seen with seatbelts in terms of laws and education campaigns that required drivers to continue to buckle up, and also education campaigns that taught drivers that you need to continue using seatbelts. And this is fleshed out in a long and very sordid history of seatbelts and airbags and how liability was balanced between seatbelt use and airbag use. And I won't go into the details of that, that's all set out in the paper, but that goes into the history of how balancing legal liability becomes very important when you want to regulate a powerful industry that can push back, and balancing the politics of legislating manufacturers and designers. And I think that actually ties in really well with what Jason's talked about in terms of the ethical, finding ways to set out an ethical framework for how designers should be legislated and what role the law has to play in terms of what designers should do. But also what you don't talk about necessarily in your paper, but what factors in there is the legal responsibilities and the liability responsibilities on designers as well. Anyways, apologies for that middle blurb. I'm a little bit jet lagged still.
It's okay. I'm going to pick up on this history point, I guess. My first question for all three of you. So I love this the question about sort of how we use history and historical parallels in making regulatory policy, I think is an interesting one. I love history. I wrote a book about Thomas Jefferson and the internet, and got all into the sort of late 18th century American history. I thought there was something there that was useful. The old cliche, those who don't understand history are condemned to repeat it. Unfortunately, the more I do this work, the more I think that those who do understand history are also condemned to repeat it. It doesn't say that they're not. The problem is, I used to be a law professor, I'm no longer a law professor, but I'm still allowed to quote Kierkegaard. The problem, Kierkegaard said, is that life has to be lived forwards, but it can only be understood backwards. And history lets us construct a narrative about what happened in any particular area, the history of automobile regulation or something else. But the participants at the time, they're looking forward. They don't have the big narrative in their head. And they're just like us. Neither do we about regulating drones. We don't know what the next move is. So this jumped out at me from Peter's paper, although I think it was sort of a rhetorical question, but it just jumped out at me. I thought it was an interesting place to start. He says, early on in the paper, he's talking about the other disruptive technologies, the internet, the computer, sort of communications technologies, and he wrote this: knowing what we know now, could we have developed better privacy practices in the early days of the internet, perhaps imposing more secure communications or a user's bill of rights? Could we impose those practices now? What lessons can we learn from the history to inform how we develop policy for robots, which is his primary concern? And I wanted to push back on that a little bit. What would we do knowing what we know now if we were to go back to 1983 and we're sitting in on they're developing the internet protocols, and we say, we know what's going to happen, so we have all this accumulated wisdom. We should make sure at the outset that we make certain decisions, we protect against certain things because we see how things turn out. I don't know what I would tell them to do, actually, knowing what we know now. And it does seem to me that this is sort of the test of the historical method. If even in a situation where you know what happens, you're not sure how you would design to prevent it or to change it. In the ordinary situation where you don't know what's going to happen in the regulation of drones, how can we know how to proceed? How can we sort of absorb the relevant information? How can we make our decisions better or wiser? So my question to the panel, so what would you tell them in 1983, knowing what we know now about the development of the internet?
I'd recommend an international internet body that could collaborate on the distribution challenges that are going to arise with the distribution of information across borders. Seeing how, knowing back then, because I'd be psychic, that information, the ability to send information quickly and easily without, being able to overcome the delay in the distribution of information and sending it over borders and being able
all
to
the problems Anupam was talking about.
Exactly.
All the cross-border issues. Set up something.
I'd say, why don't we have some kind of international organization that can address issues so that it can work to identify problems as they arise and because you need to be able to maintain flexibility. You can't predict everything as it's going to arise, but you want to also be ready to deal with problems as they come up. And so issues like cyber terrorism, transborder data flows, child pornography, issues like that. You want something in place that can deal with them as they arise.
Okay, I will get back to that, but I have a question for you about that solution back in 1983. But I'm curious if you.
Yeah, well,
you asked the question.
I thought it's the privilege of the author not to have to answer their own
questions.
No, maybe you're right. Yeah, maybe we need that Bill of Rights about that.
It's true, but it is overridden by the privilege of the moderator to demand that you answer.
Right. I guess what I was thinking about when I wrote that line was some work that Helen Nissenbaum has done on privacy and context. And that, we can think about privacy in very simplistic terms, right? That it's either private or it's public. And there's information that's, we share on our social media that we think is sort of private, but actually turns out to be public. And so we wind up in these kind of hybrid situations where it's not clear whether this, post is going to be public or private. And so that's kind of part of this kind of breaking of the mold of existing norms. And, now you interview high school kids and they have these radically different conceptions of what's private and what's public as they post things on social media than, us old people who maybe use these technologies but haven't sort of come up as digital natives. And so I think that's part of that norm innovation, is that these concepts, which we start out thinking very simplistic terms about, are actually much more sophisticated and nuanced. I think in Nissenbaum's work, it's thinking about, who's the sender and who's the receiver, what's the information, what's the purpose of the transmission of the information. And we start thinking about those sorts of terms about privacy. It's a much richer ontology. And so we can think about policy in directions that are sort of orthogonal instead of just constantly butting up against, good, bad, private, public, innovation or regulation. It's like, well, go 90 degrees and then.
But could we? I mean, and I think here really is a question about that you're all raising about when to intervene. When should we intervene in the development of norms or the development of laws? Could we have had that conversation in 1983? Even if I came back and said, here's what the internet's going to look like, no one has had the experience with it that can inform that discussion about privacy. We haven't experienced it ourselves. Oh, I see. Well, I've already gotten Fruken out of his chair. That's good. That's good. We get a check mark for that. You know what I mean?
But it was that period of wild experimentation, which was great, right? And people installing webcams in their houses and just broadcasting everything, and it is a fascinating period. But then, so how do we learn that, incubate that, or accelerate our sort of exploration of those spaces, especially where the norms and values are really important, right? And how do we even identify that, which of the norms are socially important, and prioritize them?
Exactly. How? I mean, I wonder if we can.
We need to have these discussions, and we need public discussions, right?
I think that's the key, right? So, going back, if we took the knowledge we have now, could we inject that into a debate in 1983? Probably not. It would be too much of a conceptual shift at the time, right? You'd be kind of, talking from the future to people who are, it's like Back to the Future, talking about electric guitars before.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, it's science fiction, right? And we do draw a lot on science fiction when we talk about robotics law.
But in order to inject that into actual practice, from a policy or design or regulatory, or whatever context you're talking about, it has to be close enough so that the gap you're bridging the conceptual gap isn't too far, right? So you can't jump in before there are seatbelts maybe and talk about how useful the airbag is. That's just a cost to the... Or
how intrusive it's going to feel to have an automatically locking seatbelt before people have had experience with the seatbelt. I want to let Michael get in. He's been...
But the discussion is important. Sorry, the discussion about values, about... that's something that's changed now, and going forward, we can certainly have that discussion with these new technologies.
And it's a process that it takes work, right? It's not like it just happens.
Well, hi, this is Michael Frumkin from the University of Miami School of Law. I think I really disagree with David and I guess actually with Peter, although I'm surprised he sort of gave in so easily. Because I think that, maybe I'm just too Whiggish or too optimistic, or maybe I founded this conference for the wrong reason, but I actually think that there is a very clear lesson from history, and you can learn from lessons of history. And if we had different people in the room when they were designing the DNS, if they weren't all software engineers, if you just had one lawyer in the room, it would have been different because they would have spotted issues. And I think the lesson we learned is, sure, you can't foresee the future. You can't even understand the present half the time. But you can choose who's in the room. And if you have people from different backgrounds, I think that is the lesson of history for technology policy, right? You bring doctors in the room when you're talking about car mechanics, and they say, there's a lot of carnage on the roads, and look where people are getting hurt. Right? There are, not every issue, but a really significant number of issues that are susceptible to being thought about in a different way, which leads to different policy results, because people notice there's a problem that this will cause. And that's why, I love this conference, because you get all these different people in the room who have different backgrounds, different knowledges, different perspectives. And they both spot problems, and they also spot solutions. So would we have been able to figure out DNSSEC back in, the early days? Probably not. But we would have figured out the DNS problem, because that just stuck out like a sore thumb, and it could have been engineered differently. So, and I think, so I have no idea what the percentage is, but it's significant.
Yeah, I guess I'll just one comment related to the question I was going to ask Kristen, which is, why would it have been easier in 1983 than it would be to do so now? If you think there's a need for an international body, for example, to examine these difficult cross-border flows, well, start one up. And it's the difficult questions at the heart of, the moral questions, in a sense, or the value questions that are at the heart of, say, the DNS problem. We're not going to know what they are. We could bring people into the room to identify them. I agree. We could set up an international body and say, here are the problems that are coming, but we don't have the norms have not developed. We don't understand enough about the problem to propose a good solution. We'll pick maybe a different solution than the one we picked, but why do I think that's going to be a better solution?
It's easier because people have less money invested and you know, are not dependent on not having a change. So it's not inevitable, but it's easier.
I think there's a great example, design-wise, from the history of the car, and I just briefly mentioned it in my paper because it's so interesting, and that's that the actual frame of the car, the physical frame of the car, was not designed based on safety. It was just designed based on the way it was built. It was a French designer who just built the car the way it was built because it looked good. But if you were thinking about safety, you would have used arm brakes because the arms are considerably faster than the feet in terms of reaction. Right. But now we all know the car the way it is, and it would be far too expensive to redesign and completely overhaul the car because that's just how all cars are made. But if we were to have thought of that, as Michael said, if we were to have had a doctor in the room at the time that the car was originally designed, think of all of the accidents that could have been prevented. And so if we just take that as one very simple, I mean, that's a very simplistic example, but it's just interesting to think about how easy it could have been to have had some other way of looking at it from the very beginning. And now it's too hard to go back and change all of that. Or if you look at how hard it was to get airbags put into cars because there was so much money invested and because the liability issues on manufacturers were so great because they were afraid that if they started putting airbags into cars, they'd actually become more liable for the deaths caused by cars, even though in theory, fewer people should be dying in cars. That is a very interesting conundrum, and it shows how hard it is to change the norms once they're already set, than if we just set the norms differently from the very beginning.
And that Michael's comments really inspired me to push back harder. So, which I mean, it's true that you need to go through this process of experimentation, but it doesn't mean you have to make the whole world your experiment, right? We should be having these conversations. You can do discussions, thought experiments, simulations, think tanks. You know, that's what intellectuals do. They think through ideas. And I think, you know, in this case of the killer robots, you can imagine all kinds of really bad things quite easily and start to think, well, what can we do about that? Where are existing legal norms and requirements breaking down? And where can we focus our energy on, you know, shaping a new norm?
Is this a cue for questions on this? Okay, all right, then hang on for a second. So I have a question that's sort of a follow-up on this, which is, so these cars, I guess it's related to this question about how we use the history. So there's this, Kristen sets up a nice sort of framework for thinking about regulation of users, which was followed by the regulation of uses, which was ultimately followed by the sort of implementation of the regulation of the design itself in the airbags and the automatic seatbelts and all that. How do we know whether we should have started in the history of cars? How do we know we should have started at the endpoint we have reached without having gone through? I mean, maybe that was the evolution that the regulation of the automobile had to go through. It was perfectly sensible to start with the regulation of users, to move to the regulation of uses, and to end up with the regulation. And we should follow that trajectory for robots and drones. Or, alternatively, that we should learn from that it's the regulation of the design that's the most important or the most efficient or the most effective, and we should jump immediately to that. it's an ambiguous, the history gives you an ambiguous message. Is this the evolution, is it the evolution that we want to follow, or is it the endpoint we want to reach?
I think maybe in the history of the car, it's hard to say whether there had to be that evolution. Because in the early phase of the car, there just wasn't the information to know that the shape of the steering wheel was killing people, because the data wasn't being collected. When an accident, people just assumed the technology was neutral because nobody was thinking about it otherwise, because everybody thought this revolutionary thing that's changing all of our lives and making everything better couldn't possibly also be killing us. But we can't say the same about robots, because we know better now, because we've got this history. And we know, and I'm not saying that the killing is with the car is not the analogy I'm drawing here, but we can no longer turn a blind eye. It's not 1896 anymore, and we can't say that the technology, that the users are the only ones to blame anymore, because we have this history that we can look back on, and we can now say there are all of these different elements that are interacting, and that the law has a role to play in guiding and governing each of the different elements, and that it can be effective at governing each of them. And that if we take all of them into consideration, that's when we get the most out of our technology, and that's when it's the most beneficial for society. So I think it's possible to say that in the early days of the car, we couldn't just go back to 1896 or to 1910 and say, oh, we should have been governing the design of steering wheels and seatbelts differently back then, because the medical evidence just wasn't there, and nobody was thinking to investigate in automobile deaths what was the cause, because everybody just assumed it was the driver was obviously driving too fast. But by 1960, it became obvious. And at that point, that's when laws needed to start changing, and that's when there was a role for lawmakers.
Yeah, no, I think I would disagree that it's not completely ambiguous whether that trajectory is the best or the worst or something in between. I would say that it seems like given all the understanding that we have, and that Kristen points out in her paper about the kind of psychology of use in a use context, that we're not going to get away we're not going to get the most beneficial outcomes or the best outcomes in our designs if we just regulate the user, right? We understand now that designers have a role in injecting values and norms into a use context and persuading users to do this or that with the technology. And so I think that it's not entirely neutral when you look at the history of the automobile even, or any other technology, in terms of the question of whether you should just start with regulating the user or just start with regulating design or some combination. I think the combination seems to be the winning play, right? I mean, it seems to me like you're going to get the better outcomes given what we understand now about psychology in the use context. I mean, you've written about this in the past, right? Modeling the moral user. So it's important to understand that stuff upstream in the design context. Now, whether you're regulating specific design features or regulating approaches to doing design, regulating something like quality assurance, or whether you try to promote industry norms or best practices, that's up for grabs. But I think that in all of those regimes, understanding that design plays a significant role, that above and beyond just what you can do with the user is important, and I think that's one of the. I took that to be one of the conclusions of the paper.
Yeah, and I mean we've been innovative in regulation too, right? Like we're a lot better at creating regulatory commissions and things like that we didn't have 100 years ago, right?
Right.
And we have that largely because of the car, but I think the reason we're already talking about regulating robots is because we've had that learning experience to some extent. What else can we draw from that? I mean, what's fascinating in the history is how early they were thinking about airbags and how many decades it took to actually get them in cars. And that's where it seems quite clear we didn't have to wait 20 years, right? We should have had them much earlier.
But I guess this raises the sort of related question, the governance question, is sort of who decides all of that. I was struck, I mean, I think there is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there is a disagreement between the two of you, at least, Peter and Jason, about whether these ethics, so there's this sort of ethics panel kind of approach to design, that I think Jason is sort of trying to implement in a way. It's a process, let's call it a process.
It's a methodology and a process. It borrows from a particular version of what you would do in, I'm going to pull back from the research ethics board because I recognize that there's, although I disagree with the features, but more the bioethics context in general, the way that we solve these problems on a case-by-case basis, identifying values, understanding conflicting values, trying to understand what the best way forward is, and it's not, and it tends to be focusing on capacity building and the context so that the people who are involved in making these decisions on a day-to-day basis are just kind of sensitized to the issues so they can avoid certain problematic outcomes. That's more the spirit of what I'm getting at, and when I talk about methodology and process, it's more that rather than an IRB or research ethics board approach. And I'll just say, I've realized since writing this paper and talking to a number of people that there are very distinct cultural differences in the way that research ethics boards operate. And I'm starting to notice that in the States, that seems to be very different than how they function in Canada. For whatever reason, although a lot of the guiding principles are similar. So I'm not, the methodology that I propose in this is not wedded to a research ethics board approach to doing things.
Right. But you do have a role a very important role, it seems to me, for the professional ethicist, who is the sort of competent expert,
like the lawyer,
which is.
But I think I agree
like
more than you're giving credit. Well, I think it's not the only answer, right? I'm in favor of the multiplicity, slide that Ken put up earlier. So we need all of these forms of regulation, but how do we synergize them in better ways? And I think the role of the ethicist so far has maybe been too narrowly constrained. That you have this expertise in ethics, so come tell us some stuff about values, and then we'll build our thing. And I think they need to be more deeply integrated. They need the knowledge of the engineering, and that it's also not just the sort of professional ethicist, but the social values. Like, where are those coming from? Where is the participation of the public, and who's in the room?
Why don't we see if there are questions from the crowd that can get us in one direction or another. Go ahead, Kate.
I have a question for Jason. So I really love your paper, and I think that robotics companies should pay you thousands of dollars to consult for them. If you're not doing that already. So my question is a little bit unfair in a way, but I was wondering to what extent you've thought about economics at all, because microeconomics is not a really great solution to most ethical issues, but in your paper and in your examples specifically, it seemed to me that a lot of what you're talking about is consumer choice and consumer preference, and in theory at least, that should be pretty well represented by market demand for various products. So I guess my question is, to what extent do you think we should be focusing our efforts on creating choice like within designs at that stage versus creating choice in a market and encouraging market competition on a more general level?
So I'll dodge that question almost entirely by refocusing, and I've done this in the past, so I'll just do it again. This is my move for this question, I think, is that I want to focus on saying that, so if my paper reads as though it's constraining engineers and manufacturers in such a way that we're not going to let the market decide on what products are best and how to move products forward, there are a couple things I can say to that. So the one, and this is my favorite response, is just to say that that I think there are clear examples where from a design perspective, adopting a kind of approach, and I'm not the only one, I actually pulled this from Amy Van Winsberg's paper, one of Amy Van Winsberg's papers, although I've talked about it in the past as well, kind of in parallel, is that there are examples where injecting this kind of design methodology seems to make for a better product, right? So what you're going to be able to do is at the end of the day design a better product, so that it's not a question of that you had the better design in your mind and you just unleashed it into the marketplace, and you were constrained by this sort of process. This process is, I take this optimistically to be a process where you can identify where the design is going wrong, where when you unleash this design into the marketplace, you're going to have significant user pushback. It's going to have implications for trust in you want to call it your brand, you want to call it the whole industry. So one of the examples that I use in the paper and that I've talked about in the past is this tunnel problem, right? The autonomous car is driving along and it has to make a decision whether to sort of kill you or kill a child in the road. And without going into those details, what I can say to answer your question and leave the floor open for more time is that we polled people as part of the Open Robo Ethics Initiative to ask them, what do you think? Should designers be making this choice, or should there be some other approach to solving this problem? Overwhelmingly, it was the answer was, don't leave this kind of problem up to designers. So I take that, rather they said that either users should have some sort of a choice, or we need some sort of open, transparent process where we can have legislation put in place or regulations or whatever to deal with this, so that everybody kind of is informed how these technologies are working. I take that to be an indication that that designing the better product means adopting these kind of methodologies where you can identify these kind of friction points with values and people's expectations upstream in the design process. So, and then unleash them into the market. I mean, I can make the philosophical point about, harming people and all that kind of stuff, but that seems to fall flat. So I'll make the other one, which is that you will win over your competition if you design products that create fewer frictions in terms of the ethical consequences of that technology. This is why Facebook privacy settings have blown up in Facebook's face time and time again, because they refuse. I mean, I know there's an incentive there from a market perspective. What's that?
They refuse to hire you.
Well, they just refuse to kind of, learn from their mistakes, I would say. But that's the thing. You can avoid that. So I hope that's a fair dodge and a useful answer somehow.
It is a fair dodge, but it does leave open. I mean, the question at the heart of it is, for regulatory policy, it makes a big difference whether you say, I should be able to convince these manufacturers that they will succeed in the marketplace if they undertake this analysis beforehand. So this is a tool for you to use. That's not an argument for mandating that it be used. That's important.
That argument.
Okay.
No. So again, not being the lawyer, I'll take my philosophy and my engineering and just leave the lawyering to other people. And so, but I think you could, like I've mentioned, I think you could pull these methodologies into regulation or policy frameworks at various levels, at various points, and have the discussion about how best, what is the most appropriate way forward from a regulatory perspective. So in terms, with driverless cars, perhaps Google should be pushing for that kind of regulatory approach in order to solve their problems, because maybe the technical difficulties of the alternative design approaches are too complex, and they just need some sort of industry standard approach to solving those types of problems.
And as the designer, do you want to be making that decision for everybody and building it? I think
you would want to. That's what I don't understand.
Really?
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kaleem Khan, and I'm an interaction designer. So, the question of whether or not the designer wants to be making the choice of, what happens in some of these cases is a bit moot, because the fact is we have to do that as part of our practice. So, let's look back at history to Al-Jazari, the father of robotics, and his conception of what a robot should be is something that actually benefits humanity and benefits society. And I think that designers in particular typically tend to come to their field with the notion of whatever they're going to create is actually going to be for the net benefit of humanity. A lot of the discussion that I've heard today is about regulation, which tends to be post-fact, post-design phase. And there has been some discussion of incorporating principles or constraints into design, which I think every designer would accept. So my question is, what do you see as the place of designers in regulating themselves to begin with through ethics policy or code of ethics or something of that nature, and then how does that become something that can be effective? Because designers don't scale, ethicists don't scale. There has to be something between sort of the individual designer and top-down regulation.
Yeah, I did discuss that a bit in the paper, which is, I mean, engineering ethics is a great sort of concept, but I think it's also very much framed about constraint. And the traditional notion of engineering ethics is, you're just not supposed to do the bad things and otherwise be a good engineer, right? Rather than like, how do you think through like what's good design, what's good value, what values should I be building into this system, and where is that innovation? Where is the encouragement for that innovation, right? And I think there's a lot of space for really innovative ideas in the norm and value domain occurring in design, and that happens in good design. That's part of the process. But how do we continue to, I guess, foster that? And then the other sort of problem where that sort of breaks down, and even in traditional ethics, is where the individual engineer is working on such a large, complicated project that they individually, even though they have some value view, don't have enough power or clout to shape the overall project, right? And that's where you need sort of organizational or institutional levels of coordination. And it's not just negative constraint, right? It's also positive, like we want to move the direct technology in this direction or in that direction. And then I think you also have the kind of societal level. But I don't think we have thought a lot about how we move sort of those social values into the individual choices. And some participatory design has looked at some of that. Values-centered design sort of makes explicit the values, but there's still, I think, in participatory design, it's who's the stakeholders, who's the user, and what kind of political relation are they involved in with the design process? Are they playing with prototypes? Are they talking about their needs before a prototype gets made? There's a lot of different ways, and then it just gets really complicated, but there's a lot of space to work in there.
Peter, you make what I took to be sort of a kind of extraordinary argument or claim in your paper. It's very interesting that the international treaty process, which one ordinarily thinks of as sort of the most cumbersome and sort of bewildering and slow, is actually a very effective means of norm innovation. I've never heard it described as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot with the autonomous weapons, and we're about to have meetings next week at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva, the United Nations, and the theme or the sort of buzzword everybody's talking about is meaningful human control. So instead of just thinking, how do we not have killer robots, or should we ban them, should we not ban them, it seems like a growing consensus is building around the notion that, well, we can all agree that we need meaningful human control over weapons. Now, what does that mean, right? But
at least the principle,
yeah.
There's a consensus developing about that principle.
Right, and then it's about who can participate in this discussion. So you need the military experts, and you need the computer scientists, and the roboticists, and the philosophers, and the political theorists, and the international lawyers, who are all using different conceptual understandings of, autonomy and responsibility and these things. But the more we talk to each other, the more we converge towards a consensus.
So, Woody Hartzog, Stanford University, I want to commend this entire panel. The discussion that we're having has just sent me into a euphoria. I'm glad that we're having this. The idea of design and regulatory rules. And one of the things I wanted to bring up that seems to be maybe a common theme between certainly Kristen and Jason and maybe Peter too is the idea of competing values. And this is something that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe would like to see a little bit more of in your paper. So first I'll start with Kristen's paper. One of the things that it might be wise to kind of flesh out near the end of the paper is this idea that we regulate design for cars for safety purposes, right? That's different very much than regulating technologies of surveillance because...
Privacy.
Right. Privacy has many more competing values than safety does, right? So this is also kind of the data security argument, which is kind of everybody wants data security, and we all kind of agree that this is a relative good. And this point has been made by Derek Bambau and a few others in some interesting articles. And so flesh that out because it's not a one-to-one comparison because of the competing values and how that might shape your analysis in the future. One of the things that suggested you write about in the paper also is that one of the reasons we should focus on design, which I completely agree with your thesis, that the law should care about design, is because design affects everybody. You can't get around it, right? So you cannot read terms of use, you can be ignorant of laws, but if you use a technology, you have to reckon with the technology. And so it strikes me as a very effective tool, in addition to conduct prohibitions that you focus on. And then finally, one of the things that I throw out there maybe as a potential question is, what role do existing norms play when the law starts passing rules about design? Because I was thinking about if we could go back to 1983. Well, that was a place in time, right, with certain existing norms and cultural expectations. And would it change now because our norms are very different? And then would the rules be different? And then if so, how do we kind of mesh that all together in a regulatory approach regarding design? And I'm thinking about a lot of these questions as well. And I don't know the answer, but it's worth thinking about. And then, Jason, I wonder if your tool that you've created here, which is fascinating, you talk a little bit about kind of user-centric roles. Like, so what is the autonomy of the person who would be using the robot? And one of the things that, if I missed it, I apologize, but I couldn't find it represented quite as well as the public interest with respect to robots. So there are users, and we want to design robots to effectuate users' autonomy, for example, is the example, the value that you give. But it strikes me that maybe a competing value would be the interest of the public. So the helper robot that you bring up that won't serve alcohol, alcoholism has a lot of negative externalities, right? That maybe the designer should incorporate. And so how can we use your tool to balance the autonomy of the robotic user with the larger interest of the public in public health costs or related kind of familial costs with respect to alcoholism. And then the other example, your tunnel problem, one of the things that strikes me as really interesting is how does the designer, is it enough that the designer uses the tool and goes through the process and contemplates ethical problems? Is that sufficient? Because it seems like there are also other kinds of things that the designer is going to want to balance with public interest. So the tunnel problem specifically, you can imagine that the designer is going to say, okay, so what's our goal when designing this algorithm? A child falls in the middle of the road, we can choose whether to hit the child or slam into a wall. There are ethical issues, but then there's going to be the concern about cutting down on the net number of deaths. And that's when you're going to start considering empirics, right? So statistically speaking, if we hit the child has a 30% chance of living. Statistically speaking, if we hit the wall, the driver has a 5% chance of living, right? And then we start balancing these empirics, and I wonder, and then we start looking at the public interest of net number of deaths rather than autonomy interest of the individual user. And I wonder if your tool can be used to kind of incorporate those concerns or not.
You want to kill children, is what I'm hearing.
Right. Let the record state that I do
We have
not
a
want to kill
workshop coming
children.
up on that later, Woody, about how to do that. That's in the demo. It's in the demo. We'll get to that.
We need
You have a response? any of you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all great points. And as you were talking about the competing values, safety and privacy themselves are even competing values. I mean, when you think about the black boxes that are being put into cars, and those are safety measures that are conflicting or competing with privacy interests, and there are definitely some competing values that need to be reconciled. But I take your point there, and I see those as issues that, I don't know, I think will allow for an even deeper analysis of how the balancing that I talk about in that third phase, where we're looking at how to offset the different interests of the different stakeholders and where we balance the norms between different players who are involved. I think that's that big lesson that comes out of automobile and other tech. I'm hoping to look at other technologies as well and just draw a deeper lesson from how the law can regulate technologies and what we can draw from that. And I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the comments. I mean, I'm scribbling things down because there was a lot going on in what you and what you mentioned. So I'll sort of touch on a few things, and we can certainly take it offline and discuss it further. So competing interests. So the reason I chose autonomy was you were talking about competing values. So the autonomy case in this paper is meant to provide a set of examples, obviously, to start thinking about particular cases. Because one of the things I want to focus on in the methodology of doing an ethics evaluation is that it needs to be case by case, right? You need to be talking about that person in her home, the particular circumstances surrounding the use of the robot, and then how do you think about general design cases and start extrapolating from these particular kind of user experiences. Which I think is a fair way from an engineering perspective of tackling some of those problems. So autonomy is one value or one norm that we can start using to think about what's going on in that circumstance. Certainly you could pull, a more complete design analysis would start listing different values. So I borrow from value-sensitive design to a certain extent to kind of say, look, you can draw from many different values, bring them all in, and then start getting into the details. The point being that it's messy, right? And this is one of the takeaways of this kind of analysis, is that you can't just adopt, the utilitarian perspective in a tunnel problem or any of those kind of autonomous car problems, and then just walk away kind of like this, saying, hey, look, I applied some sort of ethical thought process in that design problem. The point is that you can't do that, right? It's much messier than that, and we know that from these kind of high stakes ethics. I call them hard cases. I borrow the term, but when you're dealing with these hard cases, hard ethical cases, it involves a great deal of discussion. I mean, you could look at any topic in bioethics, and there are special issues of journals dedicated to trying to sort out these issues. So that's what I guess I'll say about the competing values, is that this is a very small example of what would be a much larger process.
So is it fair to say then that the tool that you're creating in the case of competing values basically helps, it's like an ordering mechanism, like it's a tool for ordering values, right? So because sometimes if you design something one way, it will come at the cost of something else. And so is your tool a way of kind of like ranking these and saying, okay, we're going to value this first?
So the tool is a way of getting that stuff on paper.
Okay.
Right? What's important in the ordering process? Because that's a big part of the step when you're doing this translation from, talking to ethicists to talking to engineers, right? Like there's just a vast literature that one person is aware of, and you're trying to distill that somehow into a design scenario where you've got non-experts. So the people in this room, are obviously would count as kind of, the more sophisticated designers in terms of being aware of the ethics issues, but the people in this room represent a small proportion of what you're trying to capture with this kind of design tool. So how do you distribute that into the design world? You need something for codifying and distilling these issues on papers, and so this is just a first stab at that, right? The complexities are there. These highlight the complexities. So the fact that you're asking the question, I take to be a win in terms of like saying, wait a second, like now that I've got all this kind of stuff spelled out on paper, how then do I recognize these very obvious contradictions or conflicts that come up with other values? And so it's helpful to see that, I think, anyway.
That's
I
great.
want to make sure
Thank you.
we have 12 more minutes, or you've been waiting a long time. I know. Okay.
So
Do
I
wanna
have a
get-
couple of questions. My name's Patrick Moore. I'm with UW Law. And I kind of focus at Kristen, but also Jason and Peter as well. I was thinking about your paper with regards to looking at the analogy between an automobile and a drone, and I think I'd like to restrain my comments to like aerial drones here for the time being, because it's kind of where we're at. And I was wondering if we consider the fact that I think that drones are far more resistant to regulation than automobiles, simply due to the change in industrial scale required to build them. With 3D printing and just the internet and putting together small pieces, any consumer can essentially build themselves a drone that is resistant to regulation. And I was wondering if you'd thought about how you might find bad actors who, say we have a state registration system and a licensing system, but if you've got 100,000 drones flying around in the country at any given time, how are you going to find the people who aren't following the rules and pull them out of the system? But a corollary to that, and one of the things that really scares me, I don't know if you guys have seen like this new sense and avoid technology that's coming out, is I don't want to see a world in which the state or state actors are the only people who have the authority to decide what gets done with drones, because that's terrifying. And I don't want to make a firearms argument, because I don't want to buy the NRA rhetoric, but I think there's this idea that when only the state has the access to this technology, I think the populace can suffer an enormous injustice. And I was wondering if you guys had any comments as far as that is concerned with regulatory and also design ethics.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, both questions are very interesting. Your first question, especially in terms of regulation resistant drones, when you're talking obviously about this design, regulating the design, and I think that that's a fantastic question, and I don't know how to answer that actually, now that you bring it up, because you're absolutely right that in terms of personal use drones, that could be used for whatever, carrying some illicit package or something, in terms of a signal, like this signal solution that I was talking about, or a licensing solution that I was talking about, that maybe that ends up being something that really applies in the commercial context where they have to be regulated. Which was, to be in honesty, was more what was in my mind when I was writing the paper in the first place. So I think you've raised something really interesting in that context, and I may just have to leave it there for now. And in terms of others, that actually what that maybe I will add to, I won't leave it just there. What that may mean is legislators working with designers and manufacturers and engineers and thinking about other solutions that go beyond just the design of the drone itself, in terms of, in Canada recently, there was a prison that was trying to come up with solutions in terms of drones that would identify other drones, because drones bringing contraband into prisons has become an issue. And so I know anyway, it's one possibility. So maybe that ends up being a solution. And in terms of your second question, I agree with you that this state-only drones would be, I don't think that would be a solution either. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the situation. And I think that this goes to a question that I know you were actually going to ask about whether, I don't think that, I think there's some technologies that will just happen. So even cars, even though they were causing a lot of deaths early on, they happened anyways. And it's because people saw their value through some of the harms that they were causing, some of the social harms that they were causing, because they had value aside from that. And what I think we can see from the history of the car is that earlier, some of those harms could have been curbed earlier on, and they weren't, for political reasons, for economic reasons, for social reasons. And I think that we can learn lessons from that and implement those with, for example, drones and with other robotic technologies as well, and curb some of the social harms earlier on. But I think that robotic technologies are going to happen either way. So whether we want to prevent the harms or not, they're going to happen. So I think drones are going to happen either way. I don't think we're going to have a situation where we have, say, government-only drones. People are going to have drones and household robotics, etc. And all those
But
things.
I'm going to argue a little bit against that,
Okay.
in the sense that, I mean, so cars maybe as a technology per se were inevitable, but the actual infrastructure that we built for cars was not, right? And we could have gone with other forms of mass transit that were better integrated, light rail or something like that, that would have had a higher social net value, better energy efficiency and things like that. But you know, for various reasons, we decided to build lots of paved roads and parking lots and gas stations right? So I don't think it's inevitable in that sense. And the infrastructure matters. And I guess where it comes back to the drones is, I think there's a good model with the model aircraft, group that has carved out a space for themselves to be very experimental on this kind of hobbyist basis for a long time. And where the FAA sort of steps in is where it becomes commercial. And now what does it mean kind of going forward? And if you're going to build really large things, then you sort of do fall under different regulatory frameworks. But the real question of kind of the social value is, well, are we going to allow, the Amazons who are here in town to utilize all of this airspace over, urban areas to deliver packages that are going to be buzzing around, potentially hazardous, restricting our ability to maybe do hobby flying or all sorts of other things. And now we're just going to have to live with all these drones, and they're going to be basically, taking that public space and utilizing it for their private enterprise.
Hi, so Evan Sullivan, professor at R&D. I just want to ask a question to hopefully, there's been so much going on, maybe it already came out, but I think this would be a good sort of litmus test of sort of, differences and points of overlap. At the end of the day, okay, I'm going back to your original point about sort of innovating about future norms and the paradox of that. Are there any substantial theories that any of you would sort of really latch onto as that sort of basis, right? So, I mean, you could think of something like the capabilities approach was an attempt to sort of say there's a lot of cultural difference, but nevertheless there are these kind of basic dimensions of being human, and we can, they're even coming out of the Netherlands, Oosterlaken has a whole big project about sort of assessing, developing technologies by using the capabilities. Other people have sort of robust notions of the good life. So even if you don't want to double down on a particular type of ethical theory in terms of utilitarianism or deontology, do either of the three of you, is there any particular sort of thick or robust concept that you think really sort of stands the test, that ought to be an essential part of whatever the conversation is that you'd like to have in terms of sort of proactive or ethics on offense?
I mean, I would give two that I sort of work with in my own work. So I think anytime you're talking about something that impacts human rights and things that have sort of been codified in like the UN Declaration on Human Rights, that's like a value that's gone already through a process where they had a bunch of negotiations and discussions, and it's those are values that are global and human, and that's actually a powerful kind of tool once it's been established. How and when to extend that, how to apply that, open to discussion, open to processes. And then I guess the process itself and participatory processes themselves, which don't always necessarily have a great result, but I think they're essential at some level to have that kind of stakeholder participation, the democratic participation in the discussion is a value in and of itself, in order to arrive at something that's going to affect society.
I mean, my approach kind of by necessity tends to push back on latching on to particular theories. The closest thing I could point to would be the kind of work that's coming out of clinical ethics, where as a methodology, you stay somewhat neutral on the particular value theories that you're drawing on. in order to solve the bigger problem of kind of getting past the disagreements and finding a solution that's beneficial to, to whoever's in the room concerned about that kind of issue that's going on right there. So it's kind of a weird answer, but I mean, for this kind of work, almost by design, I'm methodology, like, I will favor that methodology, but it's kind of a theory-neutral methodology. It's not really going to answer your question, but so no.
Yeah, I think you do answer his question, just saying no.
My answer might sound weird as well, but I would say my underlying themes in my mind as I'm working through this, although I don't think that they come out, one definitely doesn't come out, and the other one, if anything, is only implied, would be transparency. Which I think ties in with democracy and that idea of being very open about what we're talking about. And the other one for me personally is equality. So this sort of the charter / constitutional notion of equality, which is something that, as far as technology is concerned, I think isn't something that we maybe talk a lot about, but is something that I personally just, it underlies my thinking.
I think this has to be the last question. Sorry.
Okay, well, mine will be really quick because it dovetails really well off that. Just kind of on equality. Real quick, I'm a former 6th grade teacher. I taught for Teach for America. I'm a 3L right now at law school. And so I think a lot about low income and technology gaps. And my students sometimes didn't know how to turn on a computer. They were like 13. And so my question really was kind of, is there an ethical consideration for equality, but both in two different ways? One, in terms of the actual development of technology. Think about Bill Gates and his access to computers kind of catapulted. So who has that access to developing drones and thinking about that now? And then also on the flip end, is should we be regulating access, and access for who and for when? And I just didn't see that as much in your papers, kind of as you just nodded to Kristen. I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the both aspects of equality in this kind of new technological development, and then kind of unrolling it.
I think it's really complicated. I mean, there's certainly this digital divides and ability just to access technology and infrastructure. But there's, I think, on the flip side of that is, if you are sort of on the unconnected end of that spectrum, and now maybe you're trying to get all these people connected, but now you're connecting them to a system that they didn't necessarily design, is not necessarily designed to serve their interests and needs, but they may become, it's going to be disruptive and transformative of their culture and their society. So I think it's a complicated question, and maybe there's more room for them to also be able to innovate some forms of technologies before they're just sort of inundated with the other technology that's already been developed.
Yeah, I just as a sort of cautionary idea, I guess someone mentioned it earlier, the notion that one of the costs of a sort of regulatory approach often is that incumbents become entrenched. And that's an equality issue too. We often don't think about it, but whatever the rules are, they are often designed for those who are already in the game, and their primary interest, 9 times out of 10, is to keep everybody else out of the game, and keep the tools out of the hands of those who don't yet have them, so that they can preserve their position. So that's often, it's sort of a counterbalance on the equality side. I think there's sometimes mandating the equality ends up fostering a kind of an inequality because people are shut out through the regulatory barriers. I'm sorry, did you want to hear the last word? Go ahead.
One of the areas that I think this is really interesting in terms of drones is the use of and access to public space. So the use of drones in public space. So who has the drones? How are they being used? Who are they affecting? And whose public space are they negatively affecting? And I think that that's an interesting equality and access issue. If I get to fly my drone and enjoy it in public space, am I taking away from somebody else's enjoyment of public space? And that is a digital divide and equality issue, I think. But there are so many issues. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'd be happy to talk more about it with you offline.
The better to give them the technology or teach them how to design the technology?
Yeah.
Right. Teach a man to fish and he'll fish, or whatever.
Yeah.
Drone.
Right.
What an absolutely fascinating panel. Please join me in
Thank you.